Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to be talking to Tom Callos. Tom has been around the martial arts scene since forever. He's been incredibly influential in the development of martial arts as a business. He's been aware and involved in the very early days of jiu-jitsu when that came to North America and the development of MMA and all of that. This is going to be a real treat. I've really enjoyed Tom from afar, and I'm looking forward to getting to know him a little bit better. Tom, how are you?
Stephan, it's good to be here, and I admire your work and in the world and your adventures you've gone on. And oh man, I'm just so happy to be here. So fire away.
Well, you're in Yellowstone right now, aren't you?
I'm in a friend's cabin near the west entrance of Yellowstone. We came up in my Airstream, glamping, and they went fishing, and I didn't go fishing so I could do this interview. So it better be good.
Okay, well, we're going to keep it to about 5 minutes so you can jump on your quad and head out to the secret fishing hole. So, when did the idea of martial arts kind of cross your awareness? When did you become, what was your first exposure to it?
First exposure probably was the Green Hornet in '64, thereabouts. And, it was an interesting show geared for kids my age, And then I came across some Bruce Stegner books in a school library, and some friends and I decided we were going to learn how to throw each other. And that led me to visit an adults only. I don't think it was meant to be adults only, but there were only 5 or 6 guys there, old judoka practicing in a decommissioned military base's gym that I happened to live near outside of Reno, Nevada. And I went in and would sit in on the class. And then at the end, they would invite me on and I'd get to do some break falls and I'd throw some of them. And, they didn't teach kids at the time, but that hooked me. I probably threw my little brother and sister on the mattress in our bedroom more than I've thrown any other athlete anywhere. So it was just, I started Taekwondo because it was convenient in that we moved to another part of town and there was a school within walking distance.
Well, we've glossed over a whole bunch of critical things here. So, for people who don't know, what was the Green Hornet?
The Green Hornet was a vehicle that Bruce Lee was hired for. It was an adaptation of a comic, and Bruce played Kato. I forgot the primary actor's name, but it'll come to me in a little bit. And I think it went on for 2 seasons, maybe. And I remember Linda, Bruce's widow, one time when I was talking to her, she said that when they first got hired on for the Green Hornet, Bruce was making $400 a week.
Well, it was kind of like a Batman if
Yeah.
Robin
They
was more
actually
kick-ass than Batman.
Yeah, they met with Batman and Robin overpowered Bruce Lee, which we know would have never happened in real life. Robin, God bless his heart, he was a bit of a wimp. So
Yeah, I guess that was a battle of two shows, and as in all comic book confrontations, it's whoever the writers need to win. So I don't think we can take that victory too seriously.
It was a big deal for Bruce Lee because it was his break into Hollywood, and he wasn't making a lot of money. He was living in a friend's extra bedroom in Oakland. I used to visit Wally J, Professor Wally J in Alameda, and Bruce used to come over his house. They'd work out, and he had a dojo off the back of his house. And so when I was there one time visiting him, I said, "Did you and Bruce work out in the dojo back that we just visited?" And he said, "No, we just moved the furniture in here." And I look around, I'm thinking, this is the same furniture. It was like 1950 classics. And so at one point, when I was with Professor J, I said, "Sir, I have to use the restroom." He said, "It's right there off the living room." So I went in, I started doing my thing, and I thought, Bruce Lee Pete here. But yeah, it was real humble beginnings for them, but it was his break, and it was influential to kids my age. It was exciting to watch, and there's something about someone who can handle themselves, so they can face the fear like Kato did, and came out as the enforcer and could handle things. It's appealing to young people, especially boys, I think.
Yeah, it's a sense of power and sort of mastery over self, and to some extent, mastery over others, or at least an ability to maintain yourself in the presence of people who are trying to impose their will upon you.
Or
That's
danger.
a
Yeah. You
sure.
feel vulnerable as a kid, right? So those things seem to speak to me. But I was also deeply enthralled with the Silver Surfer and Superman, and all those comics are about very empowered, ethically grounded people who fought evil, and that appealed to me.
The judo people that you were training with, what would these have been servicemen who would have learned something when they were in Japan, or how?
Most likely, I didn't have the wherewithal to interview them at the time. I was too young, but later I found out that particular Air Force base, Stead Air Force Base, had a pretty progressive judo team back in the day. Maybe would have been the 50s, perhaps. So these guys, I think, were remnants, perhaps, of that. And there was a small judo contingent in Reno, and one of them was an uncle, a step uncle, but he had been on the 62 or 64 or 68, I've forgotten which one, Olympic team for judo. So there were some sound individuals there practicing, but it didn't have the appeal once kung fu came on.
Yeah.
It didn't have the appeal of what for kids that the striking arts did.
Well, judo was my first martial art, and I couldn't wait to get to the real stuff. I couldn't wait to get to the kung fu. Actually, I also couldn't wait to get into the ninjutsu because that was also beginning to break. That's probably, you know, one generation later than you.
Yeah.
Uh, but I couldn't wait to get to the real stuff. And now here I am rolling around, spending most of my training time rolling around on the ground. So it's a
I
return to the source.
I just had a high-ranking friend who's looking to advance in rank at some point, or is wondering what's his path. And I said, judo, return to judo. Because I spent a couple hours with one of Mike Swain's people who works with Dahlinger, who's a German Olympian in judo, and he's smaller than me, lighter, but man, he had a presence, yeah, that warrior, without being aggressive or assertive or hyper masculine. He just, I wouldn't have grabbed him with your hands. You know what I'm saying? Because he looked like a badass.
Well, the tragedy of judo is that it injuries. I mean, all martial arts carries a risk of injuries. I'm going to argue that judo carries some of the highest rates of injuries, maybe more so than MMA, but I certainly right up there. And I think it's partially the rule system. If you're throwing me, you get more points if you pick me up above your head and slam me down on the mat, preferably after tying me up with my gi somehow. And so my ability to break fall effectively is compromised, and the amplitudes are just bigger. That sport is rough.
Yeah, I would argue though that all the martial arts, when not practiced mindfully or with any knowledge about anatomy and physiology or injury prevention or any of that, they all carry that ability. Like Bill Wallace talked me into getting my hip replaced, first, because I've had 4 hip replacements. I think he could throw too, but he was mostly kicking. Overtraining is overtraining. But I was talking to Hickson recently, Hickson Gracie, and because who in that world other than Hickson Gracie is Hickson, right? But we were laughing because we had to acknowledge that most martial arts schools are run by young men and women who don't have a lot of life experience, but are enthusiastic and have the energy and the stamina to teach 7 classes back to back, roll with everybody. And by the time you're old enough and you have enough tread off your tires and you've had enough injuries to appreciate the fragility of the human body and have anything close to wisdom, you don't have the stamina to go out there and teach. It's like, oh, my back after an hour. So it is the nature of the martial arts world in most cases to have young, inexperienced people who just have a passion for what they're doing, but not really the experience to say, this is probably not a good thing to do, repetitively, like kicking, like bags. When I first started, the bag I ever saw there were 2. There was either a mattress tied on the wall, or there was a bag so heavy that it just hurt to touch it with your fingers, sand filled, because Bruce Lee had this
Yeah.
big sand-filled bag, only he could move, right? So every school I ever went to had one of those, and that constant impact on your joints, especially when you're in the growth period of being a young person, it's probably not the best thing. But none of my coaches, none of them, had any background in anatomy and physiology or injury prevention or any of those things. We were all still learning, you know, about that. And so judo, yes, it can be injury prone judoka, but and especially if you're competing to go to the Olympics or some high end thing. But I think an older teacher with some experience would make judo about as safe as Tai Chi if they put their mind to it, you know.
Well, let's take us down your road between practicing judo as a kid to the four hip replacements, because I'm sure there were some miles on the body and some stories in between those two markers.
Yeah, I didn't get good in judo, but it was my first exposure, and then that required self study and looking at books. And then we moved to a new part of town, and I joined a school run by a man named Lou Grasso. And Mr. Grasso's still around. I talk to him every few weeks, and I was 11 then, and I just loved. I knew the very first day I walked in that dojo, it was in a professional building, and that I walked in and saw a class, I knew that that's what I was going to do. I don't know how. There hasn't been another thing that I've ever stumbled upon that I said, that's what I'm going to do. And that in that case, it was. It appealed to me somehow. And I came from a family of 7 kids, and their parents were hardworking. They were having difficulties in their marriage. It was a great place to escape to and to get a sense of empowerment. And then also, it kept me out of a lot of trouble because the adults that I was hanging out with were, in general, pretty straight up, athletic, paid attention to their diets, believed in what we were practicing. That it was about these tenets and that, and not just beating each other to a pulp.
Okay.
And then so I got my black belt. I went, I was got in the tournament circuit as a young person, fought in front of the founder of Taekwondo, General Che, once, drove all the way from Reno to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to fight in this tournament run by a guy named Sun Duc Che, who, if you're a veteran Taekwondo guy, you might know him. Uh, and I drove in the back of a Volkswagen Bug, not the back seat, that space behind the back seat where the window came up. I drove in that all the way. And then everybody got so tired that, and this was, I think I was 13, that I got driving duties. And so I remember driving into Winslow, Arizona, singing the Eagle song, driving my first car, but got on the California tournament circuit, met Dave Kovar when I was 13 or 14 as a well-known martial arts teacher and friend of mine, and had the experience of meeting Ed Parker, because the West Coast California circuit was pretty hot. The Bay Area was a mecca for all sorts of martial arts, kung fu, wushu, taekwondo, karate, everything. So the tournaments were, Ed Parker would show up, Simon and Philip Ree were there, Byung Yu and his brother, Byung Hong Yu. They just did great demonstrations. Al Dacascos, all these veteran people we read about in the magazines were hanging out and active, and those were my heroes. Jeff Smith and Howard Jackson and Bill Wallace and Joe Corley and all those guys. I mean, I read from the very beginning to every ad, every line in every martial arts magazine I could steal off the stands or buy, because I was a junkie at that point.
Yeah. Black belt, inside kung fu, and then the occasional other ones that would come along and then
Yeah, the
flame out.
PK the PK magazines came out of Florida were superbly done in comparison. A friend of mine just bought Black Belt magazine. George Chung was a classmate of mine with Mr. Ernie Reyes. Anyway, I got my black belt when I was 19, and I can't say I was the best guy in the studio, but probably the best guy. I had a couple peers in there that were pretty tough and talented, but I decided I was gonna, having seen Ernie Reyes's group in the Bay Area competing, At that time, they weren't called West Coast. They were called, it was under his instructor, Master Che. And I decided, and I heard that Taekwondo might be in the Olympics. And I said, I'm going to go to the Olympics. So I started calling around to instructors who I'd read about in the magazines. And I'd seen some of the West Coast demo team athletes, Mr. Reyes' students on the circuit. So one day I said, I'm going. I packed up my motorcycle. I had a friend who lived a few miles away. I slept on his couch, packed up my Honda 750, kissed my girlfriend goodbye, and drove down to San Jose to sleep on my friend's couch and join under Ernie Reyes. And the reason I said I was maybe one of the better guys at my school is because when I got there, I was the worst black belt. You know, I had beautiful basics. You know, every move was perfect. Stances were strong. But what Ernie Reyes had was flow. They had a level of flow and spontaneity in their movement and adaptability that I had only witnessed watching them at performances and being in the classes and transitioning from a staunch, rigid, almost Shotokan style of exactness to this loose, mobile jumping. It was beautiful, and I had a good time. And I became a member of his famous demonstration team that traveled America and the world doing comedic performances that integrated martial arts with comedy to, you know, take the edge off the violence. Oh, I wanted to be on that team so bad. I basically hung on to Mr. Reyes's leg until I got invited into practices. I'm sure I was obnoxious, but I wasn't going to take no for an answer. And that hanging out with those people, Cynthia Rothrock was on the team, George Chung. They at that time when I joined the school, 7 or 8 of the top 10 national kata competitors trained in that one school in San Jose that I joined. And I was in pig heaven. I really was.
So this is the kind of the era when Taekwondo was moving away from basically being a karate, a Shotokan derivative, to becoming its own thing. Is that fair to say?
It was an evolution, you know, influenced by, you know, it wasn't, Taekwondo wasn't a thing. It was, it's like art. You know, there were lots of people practicing art, and they all had their own interpretation. And style names are really brand names. You know, I call this Taekwondo because I want to differentiate myself from that, whatever that is. This is what we do, and this is our brand, and this is why we're better. You know, that's all the styles are really branding. But do they really, you know, is there really a border between California and Nevada? Only in our minds and on maps. It doesn't really exist. It's a way to be political, to control resources and have something be a responsibility of somebody, and that's the style. So Taekwondo was, yeah, it was rigid the way we were practicing, but there was already, you know, because of the magazines and entertainment, there was already a change afoot. And this eclectic approach that Bruce Lee championed and that was adopted by so many to do it one degree or another.
And Nevada's close enough to California to get caught up in this whole very exciting melting pot phenomenon.
Yeah, it was cool. And so what Taekwondo is and isn't, it reminds me of an idea that I had about how we teach. You teach what you know. You know, you don't teach. You can't teach what you don't know. So the schools, the Kwans, the whatever, were really driven by the knowledge of the teacher. You know, there was some things that adopted. We don't know why, but we're cutting off the end of the ham because it fits in the pot. An old Zig Ziglar story about, you know, why we do things. Some of them have reasons or origins that we know nothing about. We just do it because that's how we were taught. But there was, I think it really was up to the mind of the instructor or instructing team. If they had judo experience, breakfalls became a part of it. If they had taken other styles, those things were pulled in. If they were doing their own research, that all affected what we were doing on the mats. And it's still that way today, I think, you know, especially in jiu-jitsu and MMA that's become so popular. You know, they're not things. they're like art, where the instructor's interpretation of what he or she thinks it is what they teach. And of course, it evolves. So, does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I never practiced Taekwondo, but of course I took whatever martial art books were in the library. I took them out and brought them home to study because maybe the secret's in this book. I'm
That's right.
sure that sounds familiar. Uh, and looking at older Taekwondo books from the 1950s, and then taking a look at more modern Taekwondo, the forms, the kata, completely changed. And the forms in the earlier books were basically the exact step for step, the same as uh, Shotokan.
Well, absolutely. When I first started, they were still doing Basadai and JK forms. But, there was a lot of political conflict between the Koreans and the Japanese.
Mm.
And so, I remember being around a couple Korean, one specifically, I called what we were doing karate, and oh man, he just about tore me off to pieces. It's not karate, kind of thing. And there was just this opposition because of the cruelty of those conditions that the Japanese put upon the Koreans and the resentments. And so, that there was a reason they changed the forms, and that they wanted to be able to rebrand what they were doing as something that because there was so much animosity uh, to the Japanese.
And then invent this myth wholesale that was still around when I was starting martial arts, that this Taekwondo had developed. The reason for all the high kicks and flying kicks were to knock Mongol invaders off their horses when the Mongols had tried to invade Korea.
I heard it too.
And even as a 12-year-old or 13, I was like, come on, really? Like, if I was facing a Mongol with a bow on a horse, what are you going to do? You're going to run a quarter mile and then sidekick them? Come on.
Well, maybe if the stage was set properly and you could jump off a boulder, but
yeah,
there's a lot of.
But I understand why they did it. I came to learn why they did it, and that was, like you said, there was a tremendous amount of cruelty during the Japanese occupation of Korea, and it went back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
And there's something about jumping that's youth oriented. To leap, to jump, it's beautiful. Junri said to me, who's a friend of mine, he said that martial arts is beautiful in every country, regardless of whether there's a language or cultural difference. It's because it's all about lines, straight lines and circles, and expression of emotion and creativity. And it seemed a reasonable explanation to me. But yeah, styles are a funny thing, and we do this or we don't do that. That's all a construct that doesn't have to be followed, or you may follow it at some point in your career until it no longer serves you, and then you figure out it's just movement. There's only so many ways to move. And there was a famous teacher, Myungji Bando, and I got to spend some time with him one time in a seminar in Texas, where we were just hanging out because I was teaching, he was teaching, and he said that a lot of the way that the martial arts evolved was cultish and tribish. That there was this idea that you weren't allowed to go look at somebody else's stuff or go to their school or whatever, because these villages, these cultures were fighting each other often and frequently. And if they could have an upper hand because they were practicing something with a weapon, or, that would give them an edge, they didn't want to give it to their enemy. And so there was this tribal closeness that, we didn't share because it was contingent upon our survival, and that carried over somehow. And that seemed to me to be a reasonable explanation about this style, that style, we do this, we do that. But the reality is that you do what you have to do when it's time to do it. And if you come out ahead, then you've accomplished what we set out to do,
I think it's also undeniable that approach, thou shalt not study with other people, thou shalt not show people from other schools your techniques, thou shalt not even show people within your own school the techniques or forms that you've learned, all of which I encountered in my training, there are also student retention mechanisms. Because if I can show you whatever the technique is and you can show me, well, what's the purpose of the instructor? Why are we paying the instructor? And if I go train at another school, there's always a chance that I'm going to say, man, this fits my temperament or my end goal so much better. I'm going to pack up and leave. So it's also kind of rare for religious cults to encourage people to go attend the services or the gatherings of other religious cults. Kind of weird, right? I'm not calling Catholicism a cult, but there aren't very many Catholic priests telling people, why don't you go to that Unitarian church as well?
Well, the last time I walked into a church, there every wild animal from 100 miles around turned their heads and birds flew off, and it was so I can't speak to that, but I can say that it seems to me to be an aspect of human nature, and that it isn't just a martial arts thing. As I lived through the martial arts, at some point I realized that my goal wasn't to be a great martial artist, because it was such a small piece of the pie of life, that the real a more sensible goal and more holistic was to be a good human being. And that I've met people who were really high end martial artists who weren't really hadn't evolved as human beings in a way that felt good to me. And then so it wasn't, I don't say martial artist, I think human being when I say that. And I don't think martial arts, I think life. You get good at martial arts, there's so many other things that have nothing to do with kicking, punching, or choking somebody, where you can apply the discipline, the respect, the perseverance, the stamina, the repetitive nature of practice, and cultivate a great life and contribute to the lives of others. And so it's not martial arts, it's about life, and it's not martial artists, human beings. If that's relevant to what we were talking about.
I don't think there's anything more relevant. I mean, I think martial arts can be a tool for self-improvement. Certainly it's a tool for becoming tougher and increasing resilience, perhaps, but or becoming stronger. But strength in itself is not an asset. Let's pick the ridiculous example. There's that maxim that all internet arguments devolve to somebody calling somebody a Nazi. Do we want stronger Nazis, right? If strength is inherently good, then it depends. I'm going to argue it isn't, because it depends who is stronger. And it's a tool. Strength is a tool. Martial arts skills are potentially a tool. But what are you using that tool for? Is a hammer good or bad? I don't know. It depends if you're using it to build a house or using it to hit somebody over the head with. Those are two very different things.
I often quote Jun Rhee because I met him at a time when I didn't have a filter for him, because I respected him, because he came from a position of power. I'd watched him in books and heard about him, and he was revered. And so while my father might have been saying the same things to me, I was like, well, you're my dad. What do you know? And but when you meet the right person and that you respect, sometimes you can hear things. So what I remember Jun Rhee saying to me is nothing. He stole it from Shakespeare. Nothing is either good nor bad except what your own thinking makes it. And there's some relevance to that in martial arts, that. But I think that taxi driving, chopping wood, pickleball. I can't believe I said it, but pickleball. all of the all of life is usable as a tool for your evolution. It can make you tough, it can make you resilient, it can teach the lessons. All of that is the same. If we choose martial arts, and if martial arts has an advantage, it's because the intent. Like, I took a class one time with a couple of martial arts teachers, and it was rock stacking. We were stacking rocks in the Bay Area, in the Berkeley area, and it was a form of art. And this guy, it made it really cool, but so we went to do this class, right? And I'm thinking, he sits us, the three of us down, and he says, now, before we begin, what is your intent? And I'm like, well, I'm going to frickin' stack some rocks, But he was trying to reveal something that he had discovered through his practice, I'm assuming, because I didn't quiz him at the time, about beginning with the end in mind, about your intention of practice. And in the martial arts, if you have a good coach, a lot of times they're you're learning your stuff from doing it. You're learning, you pick it up and then you got to practice it and figure out how it works on your time. But the direction of the coach can make a big difference as to where your head's at. If the coach is experienced enough to draw parallels between the frustration you have getting crushed on the bottom and the frustration you have in other aspects of your life, and how it's important to stay calm, to breathe, to move incrementally, to be mindful and aware of where you are at the very moment, and to understand your opponent. If you can do that in other things, now you have a gift. Now you've taken the work off the mats and put it to work in the world, which is I think I created that slogan, but I ripped it off from a famous yogi named Sean Korn. She had this program, off the mat into the world. In other words, taking yoga principles into your life. And I called her and I said, could I use out of the dojo and into the world? And she said, yes, of course. So that idea is an evolution of how I feel I moved to become an instructor. First level was, I can kick your ass, so obviously I'm a good teacher. You can't beat me. Then I grew up a little bit, and the next phase was, well, look at my students. My students are winning in all the tournaments. I mean, obviously I'm a good teacher. And then I grew up a little more, evolved and matured, and I thought, well, look at the size of my school. I mean, I have 800 active students. And look at my car. I'm driving a Porsche. Look at my gross income of the school. I must be a good teacher. These are all signs of success. Then I grew up a little bit more, and I realized the only real, to me, important measure of my skill as a teacher was how my students were taking what we were practicing on the mats and putting it to work in their lives to the betterment of people, places, and things, not just for self-improvement, which is obviously part of it, but how you affect others. And when I saw students taking that focus and the discipline and the kinship of camaraderie in the classroom and bringing it into the workplace and at home and into the world, I felt that was the high, that I couldn't go any, there was no other level that I've discovered since then that is more important as a measurement of the teacher. And I used to run a program called the Ultimate Black Belt Test. It was an avant-garde experimental program. I was so disappointed with black belt tests, and I'd seen so many and been in a share myself. And I thought, this is a hazing. It's not really a test. It's like I used to go when I was in college. I would have a test coming up on Monday. So Sunday about 6 o'clock, I'd start cramming, and I'd pass the test the next day. But my retention was, don't ask me what I did because I can't remember. It's not the test day. It's not the day of the test or the week of the test, or that you fought 10 people in a row or whatever. Let's look at the long term, your practice, how it's changed you as a person and affected those around you. And one of the ideas I got from Adbusters magazine, they had this black dot theory, which was, if you were wearing an Izod or something, you could put a black dot over it because you weren't a representative of the company and you resented carrying around somebody's logo. Well, I thought, what if you took a black spot over the tester? We would test you, but we couldn't see you, like a black hole. You can only see how it affects everything around it. And that would be the real measure, not what you do, not how many bricks you broke or how many matches or of tournaments you won. It was, how has your journey affected your family, your students, the community you're in, and if you're lucky, the world around you. And so that has something to do with what we were talking about. Yes?
How did you ever create this test? And
Oh,
how
yeah,
what
yeah.
did it look like?
It was, it went for a year. So you enrolled, and it was a year-long program with a graduation at the end. We had 2 other times we would meet. During that year period, you would journal. And at the time we started it, blogging hadn't taken off. So Farabor Zajak, a friend of mine, accomplished Hapkido teacher, can't even call what he does Hapkido anymore. It's an eclectic brand. In Thousand Oaks, was also one of the first competent internet guys in the martial arts community. And so he built a website for us that we could blog every week, because I had listened to a guy named Joseph Campbell, who was a professor of religion and mythology in Southern California, wrote a bunch of books like The Hero with a Thousand Faces and The Hero's Journey. He defined the hero's journey as the Exodus, the Epiphany, and the Return. You go out, you learn something, you come back and tell your story. And the story of these candidates testing for black belt a year, I wanted it to be like the Olympics. Just that you're training for the Olympics is a story within itself, whether you win or not. That you're going to climb Everest on your hands and knees, that's a big story. You may not make it, but what training do you go through to get there? And in the martial arts community, we had a lot of assumptions about what instructors went through to get their rank. Was it Kwai Chang Caine in the temple picking up the thing, getting the tattoos burned in? And surprisingly, there was very little that would have been impressive. And I said, let's make that transparent. Let's be the change that we'd like to see in the martial arts community. And so a year gave us a chance to read the books, to practice and learn things we didn't know, and to do all sorts of things you couldn't do in the hazing of a weekend or a day, which were more indicative of success as a student and as a teacher than would be that, hey, look, my guy just broke 7 bricks. He's 280 pounds, but he broke 7 bricks with his elbow, black belt. So we did 50,000 push-ups, 150 a day for a year, 50,000 sit-ups, 1,000 rounds of sparring, 1,000 repetitions of a single kata, 1,000 in a year is 3 a day, manageable. And we did a day in a wheelchair, a day blind, a day mute. I called it empathy training. We did, if you weren't a boxer, if you hadn't had any punching, I was so sick of watching karate guys, taekwondo guys, couldn't punch their way out of a wet paper bag. I said, you got to get 20 hours with a boxing coach. And so now you had the opportunity to film that and to document it. And it showed the journey that you were taking to your next rank, whatever it was. You had to mend a relationship gone bad, fix 3 wrongs you've done in your life. What else did we do? We had 3 events that we went to, the final event, and everyone was made up of multiple activities. For example, we did an eco adventure. I called it on the Pacific Crest Trail, 4 days, 3 nights. And I wouldn't let it, nobody brought their cell phones. They weren't allowed. No tents. They all had to sleep out in the open. And this journey was brought about by a book I'd read called Last Child in the Woods. And I met the author. And it influenced me to say, okay, we have a chance to, he coined the phrase attention deficit disorder. And that the author had talked about his experience as children like we did, and how it was open play in the cornfields of his town, paths, forts, this and that, and how some of that play had become illegal. Like I live in a carefully controlled community, HOA. You can't go dam the stream. You can't build a fort in one of the trees, you'll get cited,
Mm.
And so I took them out in the wilderness because I knew that would give us a chance to bond, to talk, not to be distracted by this tool we're talking on right now. Oh, it was so funny, Stephan. It was so funny. The guys had never camped, most of them. One of the guys in the test, and I won't mention his name because it's so damned embarrassing, he tried to bring up his carry-on luggage into the Sierra, and he had taekwondo shoes on, the kind, that were super light.
No.
Oh, dumb as dirt. But so we had to get that fixed. Another guy brought his son's Barney sleeping bag, just about died of hypothermia before we all pulled out our emergency blankets and helped him survive. One guy covered himself in DEETs. We had to carry him out. And one of the guys, a pretty tough guy, who since passed away, died on the mat, as a matter of fact. His name was Gary Corey, was an instructor back east, a friend of mine. Gary said, I've camped out before, so I'm not new at this, but I got scared about 1 a.m. and I went back in the house. So after the first year taking them on this adventure, I didn't pack food anymore because they packed so much food. None of them knew how to backpack, that they had a month's supply of food for a 3-day trip. So I just started eating out of their packs. And it was funny, but it was revealing, and it allowed me to have time with them. And I hoped, and the intent was, that they would have a good time and turn around and take their students on similar adventures, because kids were suffering from nature deficit disorder. They hadn't camped out. Their parents are busy. They're working, so this was a chance for an instructor to exert his or her influence in ways that encompassed nature, which is something that you're really into. So,
A little bit.
yeah. But
Yeah,
and then another event was we'd have an eco, that was the eco event. Then we'd have some community involved event, like we did a beach cleanup under the Golden Gate Bridge because it was just strewn with debris after a storm. And Dan Millman from Way of the Peaceful Warrior, a friend of mine, came to join us and clean up. And one time we were in New York for one of these events, and we went to Gleason's boxing gym and boxed with the pros there, and trained with them. It was a kick. Then we went over to the Bowery and peeled potatoes in the Mission. My goal was to spend time with them and to give them opportunities to look at how martial arts belongs in the community, not just in your school. And the other great event that we did in this Ultimate Black Belt test was a 7-year commitment to an avant-garde architectural program based in rural Alabama called the Rural Studio. It was run by a fellow named Samuel Mockbee. Mockbee won the MacArthur Grant, which is known as the Genius Award. And he was an architect, a practicing architect who taught at Auburn University. And he said, I'm not going to teach kids architecture by building walls on campus. He went out into the sticks where he'd grown up in Alabama, and they rented a house. And the students came for their semester and had to build a pod for themselves to live in. And then they built homes and renovated homes in the community to learn about architecture. Mockbee called it an architecture of decency, where everybody should be able to afford a beautiful home that's high functioning and warm and safe. And they were building them out of found objects because they had a small budget. So tires, compressed carpets. One of the cathedrals that they built in this little stick town and I took all these black belts, sometimes as many as 100 would come to join me, and out to see these spaces, because Mockbee had become in architecture what I wanted to be in the martial arts. I wanted to transcend the subject matter, and I felt an obligation to social justice. And so we would go every year for 7 years, from 30 people to as many as 100 or more, and we raised money all through the year. And so we would go build a home in a weekend or renovate structures as much as we could do with these architects. And a lot of just like the campers, most of these black belts had never swung a hammer, so they were all getting new skills, and they ended up bringing kids. Their kids would come with them, and seeing these teenagers with tool belts on, and some of them were influenced by their time in this Greensboro, Alabama, where we were. They became landscape architects or pursued architecture because of what we were seeing and experiencing there. But we ended up raising $250,000 over the 7-year period and facilitating 40,000 man hours of volunteer time. And the schools there were still segregated, not legally, but all the black kids went to that school. When we went to the black school to give a demonstration, teachers are still wearing paddles on their sides, big, long paddles with the holes in them for extra pain. And I remember walking through the school, and the only computers in the school were in the office. It was really rural Alabama. It's called the Black Belt, that area, because of the soil and the influence and the poverty. And some of the people, like some of the houses that we worked on, mostly trailers, because the trailer companies would sell these trailers that only had a short life, but they'd sell them on 30-year notes, and make it so you get a free TV and internet, and so trailers were being put up and they didn't add to the property value. And sometimes the plumbing from the trailer just went out into the field, and that was it. That was where the sewage went. No official plumbing. So I'd bring these women from LA, athletes, martial arts people. They'd come in short shorts and tank tops, and we were being hosted by Amish people, and and it was a trip. And they were seeing all this stuff for the first time. The level of poverty and prejudice was, you could cut it. It was so thick in the air. And what happened with Samuel Mockbee is, I was working for a company called the National Association of Professional Martial Artists. We produced a monthly package for school owners to help them with ad slicks and magazines and video. And I oversaw a lot of the content that came through there. One day I was doing that and I thought, and I read, and I was traveling a lot teaching seminars, and several times I came across magazines with Mockbee's students' work in it. And I said, okay, I got to meet this guy. So I start calling him one day, can't reach him. Auburn University, the rural studio, nobody's answering their phone. I'm leaving messages. That very night, my wife and I went into Borders Books, which shows how long ago it was. And I pulled off a Architectural Digest, opened it up, right to Mockbee's obit. He had died of cancer just a couple months before, unbeknownst to me. So that next week, I got a call from one of his interns, a woman named Pam Dorr, and Pam became our liaison there and facilitated this social work. The goal of that was that I said, in my mind, I thought, martial artists, you got to take the work out of the dojo and put it to work in the world. That's when that's your advertising. That's your proof. Proof being that if you're an artist or an architect or a graphic designer, you sell your work based on what you can produce, not on promises. And in the martial arts, we were a promise-based industry. And the school that opens right down the street with a young man financed by his parents, he can say the same things you say because they require no proof: courtesy, integrity, self-discipline, self-defense. It was all just talk, no evidence. And I said, we have to become an evidence-based industry where we show what we do. And so I had to show these instructors, in my mind, what it was to organize community events that benefit the community, that put people into a place where they just can't say no because you've impacted them. And that story about just saying no is another Junri story, if you'll permit me the time. Junri, I asked him, I was working on this program after 9/11 when I heard George Bush Sr. say, I think it was Sr., say one of the benefits that's come out of this horrible tragedy is that the millions of acts of kindness that people are doing for each other. And I thought, at that time we had a couple thousand martial arts school clients at NATMA, and I said we could do 1 million acts because every one of these schools has from 20 to 1,000 members. If we got each student to do 10 acts and they got one of their free, and it was easy to do the math. So I started the Random Acts of Kindness program where martial arts students would go out and do acts of kindness, record them, and the teacher could come back and draw the line between why this has anything to do with self-defense and martial arts and how important community was and the people you hang out with, blah, blah, blah. So I was asking Junri, Farah Jacques was doing the website, and Junri was kind of my liaison in Washington. He was lobbying for September 11th to become National Acts of Kindness Day. And he had been teaching in the congressional gym for 35 years for free. He used to run tournaments between Democrats and Republicans, which we need today, karate tournaments. And so I said, can you get Chuck Norris to help us with this? And he said, yes, I think we can. But first, we have to put him in a position where he can't say no to us. And he said, Tom, if you ever want somebody to absolutely do something for you, you got to do so much for them that when you ask them for a favor, they can't say no. And I instantly adopted that and understood the logic in it. And that's powered my involvement in the martial arts, to try to do so much for your community that they can't say no when you ask them to join, when there's such a direct line between how you're positively affecting the people, places, and things in your community, because every martial arts school has a little army. And one another Junri sayings was, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, an action's worth 1,000 pictures. So it was all about taking action. And so if you could mobilize your students to do just little things in the community, there was no better proof that because you could compile them. Like you could say, well, so far my students have done 16,000 acts of kindness. And it was like McDonald's, we've sold 300 million hamburgers. It seemed to me a better way than to do what was popular at the time, which was to drop off coupons on people's doorsteps, or to buy a phone mailer that automatically dialed the list you'd bought and tried to pitch your stuff over the phone, or to go to fairs and sit there for 18 hours and try to convince people to take lessons. Go out and affect somebody viscerally, affect their lives, make it better. And that's your marketing. And that way we became an evidence, because you could take the things that your students were doing, regardless of the subject matter. The kid who was interested in astronomy, who organizes this was called project-based leadership training, which is relevant to acts of kindness. You could take the interest of the student and let them apply their martial arts to that. So if it's astronomy, if it's their brother has diabetes, if they want to help seniors in the community, if they are environmentally minded, they could apply themselves to some project, and you could take credit in part for that and use it as evidence as to how your martial arts is not just practiced on your mats, but affecting the community. This was the aspect of the ultimate black belt test, which I think was most important, was every test requirement, because I'd always taught in a way that made the student do everything that I wanted them to do. They had almost no say in it. I was dictating, you're going to do this foot moves first, blah, blah, blah. And I thought the ultimate test isn't really what I know and what I require. It's getting the student. Like, what if you have a student who's a scientist or an astronomer or is an author? What do they bring to the test? And what would they do as a requirement? What's challenging to them? So part of the test was to deeply interview the participants, as you would in your school, and say, well, what do you care about? And if somebody said, well, you know what I care about most is my family. And I'd say, well, if care for your family were measured on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the ultimate, like there's nothing more than 10, and 1 was nothing, where do you think you rate yourself? And most people would say 5, 6, maybe 7, if they're really narcissists, you know. And I'd say, well, what's the difference between 7 and 10? Oh, well, I do this, I do that. I'd say, okay, that's going to become part of your test then. When you took the students' ambitions, regardless of what they are, weight loss, write that book, take care of the family, do that adventure they'd never done, like some of the ones you've been on. When you integrate that into the test and that becomes a part of their requirements, suddenly the goals of the company and the goals of the employee are congruent, which they're often not. And so and then when you were talking about at the end test or in the fruition of the test of a year, because you have a year to talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it and where you fail and why you thought that was a good idea, but it ended up not being a good idea. All these things become advertisements for your school because they all carry a link back to what you're doing. So you can, if you did what I did, was read an article about diabetes, 1 in 3 children affected by diabetes in the next decade. This was a couple decades ago. I said, well, I don't know anything about diabetes, so I never talk about it in the classroom but I walked into a classroom and I had 40 kids. I went 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I realized this is a self-defense issue. Diabetes is a horrible disease. So I wasn't talking about it or teaching anything or tying it into self-defense because I didn't know squat about it. So part of the ultimate black belt test came, I said, well, what do you know that you bring to the table, or what do you want to know? And in a year's time, rather than a weekend, you have time to explore those things. And every time you fail, because failure is certainly going to be a part of an aggressive test like this, what did you learn? And you could tell your students, listen, I'm going to fail too. But when I fail, watch what I do. And that would be documented. And let's say you had a student who does something memorable and they're 14 years old. Well, 10 years later, when they're 28 and they're often graduating from college or into their career, they're still selling your school because that story is evergreen on the internet. Mm-hmm. And any parent who's interested in their children doing things that are extraordinary or using the martial arts as a tool for positive things in their life, that story is going to sell them. And let's say you did 3 of those stories a day for a year, you'd have 1,000 stories. There isn't 1,000 pieces of evidence for any martial arts school in America online where you can reference them, but you can go to many artists and see 1,000 paintings or on my site, you can see my work as I work towards 1,000 portraits. I'm a portraitist. So anyway,
I definitely want to get to the art, but let's just, I mean, you've said so much that's of value. I think it goes back to the potentially incredibly important role of an instructor in a student's life, especially if that's a young student, and how this is, it has the potential to be so much more than just teaching someone how to punch, kick, choke, and lock joints. That being said, many of the things that you just mentioned, I know there's people rolling their eyes. Oh, beach cleanup, some kind of green environmentalist. Oh, low income housing. How woke. And this, giving a shit about other people. Oh my God. And especially in the last 4 or 5 years, and especially in the jiu-jitsu and MMA space, which I know you're very familiar with, this kind of denigration of anything giving a shit about other people, especially people who are lower than you or in a vulnerable position, is just a disgusting aspect of the martial arts now. And I know a lot of people struggle with that. I'm not saying all martial artists, not at all, but it does seem to be on an upswing. So how has martial arts gone bad here?
I just attribute it to youthful ignorance, or ignorance if you're not young. It's just, it's an evolution.
Do you not think that it's increasing? I think it's increasing.
Well, the media makes a big deal out of things that were probably prevalent before we knew it, but didn't get exposed to it like we do now. This intolerance for wokeness, it's simply ridiculous, in my opinion. But until you get old enough and have your parents die, or to have some heartbreaking injury, or to have a child be ill, or to have any life experience that opens your heart and opens your mind, and that you start looking at self-defense holistically. Like, I've been doing martial arts for 50 years. I've never had a serious confrontation with anybody. I've stepped into a domestic abuse one time and took the guy down and just cooled it down, didn't hurt him. But I've never really nobody's ever really tried to hurt me. But, oh my God, when my parents died, when my children were born, my hips, I read an article one time, and this really affected me as a teacher. The top 10 killers of men, women, and children in the Western world. Martial arts, rear naked choke, punch to the face. They weren't on there. It was suicide and COPD and diabetes and things that I never talked about because I knew nothing about them. And so it sent me on a mission to learn, and it opened my eyes.
I would argue part of the problem now is that, especially in internet culture, it's almost the opposite. You don't need to know anything about it, just talk about it. I mean, two white guys on a podcast talking about stuff that they don't know about, keeping in mind that we're two white guys on a podcast.
Yeah.
It's a trope, right? Like, today I'm going to be an expert in Ukrainian history. Tomorrow I'm a history in Israeli Gaza history. That's coming after my stint as a vaccinologist, and probably going to lead right into, I don't know, constitutional law. Why? Because I'm a black belt and I've got a platform.
Well, when I was thinking about being in the Olympics, or when I felt that I was a serious athlete, when those times were on, like everybody listening to this, you understand you have to filter out distraction to a degree. So if you're really super serious, I had a friend who was in the Olympics, Diane Murray. She was in when it was a demonstration sport in Barcelona. She took a silver medal. And so I was chatting with her one time, and I said, well, of all the athletes in Taekwondo that want to go to the Olympics, how many think actually get there? And of course, at that time, they didn't have a full roster. They were picking weight divisions. So, but I said, would it be 10%? She said, oh, no, much less. And I said, let's pretend it's 3%. I said, so if we had 100 athletes up, 3 had the talent, the time, the coaching, the money, whatever it took to get there. But when you're 3 out of 100, there's 97 other people over here going, who don't think like you do and don't do what you do. They're thinking, oh, my grandfather smoked until he was 90. He was healthy as a cow. Or what you eat really doesn't matter. I mean, in the end, they had different belief systems and they had a big support group to encourage that behavior. But the 3%, actually much less, but the 3%, they were doing things different. So if I'm going to write a novel, I'm not going to go to the 97 who failed, not that they don't have some wisdom to impart, but I'm probably going to gravitate towards the 3 best-selling authors. And many times, upstanders, people who've done, accomplished, endured, they have belief systems or practices that the other 97% don't even think about. And I think in today's internet world, it carries through. You have to filter what you allow to affect you and be one of the most important self-defense lessons is be mindful about the people you spend your time with, because they can have a huge impact on your belief systems and your actions. And, so be mindful about that. And it's just, we get a lot of chatter now, but there's always been some of that. We were debating what was better, karate, judo, or whatever, when I was a teenager, and what style would prevail. And it's just that most of the instructors are young people who are still trying to figure things out. And so you get a lot of weirdness, but just have to sort it out. And in art, you go into a bookstore, you go into an art gallery, you can tell immediately who's not ready for prime time. It doesn't stop them from painting, doesn't stop them from publishing, but not all books are worth reading and not all paintings are really masterful. And in the martial arts community, not all opinions are really sound. But I forgive arrogant young men and women who are talking out of their lane, who don't know anything, because I was one of those. And I understand that it's part of the evolution, the verbalizing what you think you know and then looking back. Because when you're 25, you think, okay, I've got my shit together now. You turn 30, you go, oh, geez, I was such a numbskull. 35, you do it again. It's just part of the evolution. They have to experiment.
I suppose this is especially poignant now, given that your association with BJ Penn, who you had a very large role in introducing to jiu-jitsu, and his latest round of legal troubles. We're dealing with young men who are to some extent going through a large phase of their life, excluding. They're doing martial arts. They're not going to university to study molecular biology. And then at the same time, they're also accumulating a whole lot of head trauma. I'm not saying that CTE is part of BJ's current problems, but I wouldn't bet against that either.
Yeah, well, BJ is struggling right now. We all struggle at some point in our life, I believe, and a lot of us get to hide it. And for whatever reason, because of the internet culture, as BJ struggles, he's posting and it's confusing to the audience. He's struggling and he's going to get help. And he was a remarkable young man. His dad came to me. He was an old judoka when I moved to town. In fact, the story, which I've told many times, so I'll just make it quick, was I came to Hilo to live. I'd been living on the other side of the island, but my new girlfriend wanted to go to college, and we'd had a friend who was commuting who died on the commute. And I said, no, if you want to go to college, well, I'll just pick up. We'll move to Hilo. So I'm on the mainland giving seminars. She goes and rents the house from BJ's dad. I come to town, and I call him on the phone to arrange payment and do all that from wherever I'm at. And when I get to Hilo, the first thing I do, because she's going to take me to show me the house she's rented, first thing I do is say, first, I got to go put up flyers in the local gyms, weightlifting gyms, whatever, fitness, because I'm a year out from testing for, I think it was 6th Dan or 5th Dan, I can't remember. And I've got to get ready because in Ernie Reyes' school, a black belt is like your Olympics. You do everything you can to get ready, which deeply influenced my black belt testing process. So I go put up the ads, the little tear off for my phone numbers, right? I get to the house. I've already ordered phone service, so we bring our phone in. There's no cell phones then. Plug it in. It rings within a few minutes. I pick it up. I recognize the guy's voice. I'm like, how do I know it? I don't even know anybody in Hilo. Who are you? Turned out it was BJ's dad. The kids had found the flyer, brought it home, said, we want to do this, because I was looking for judo or jiu-jitsu partners because I was just learning at the beginning, and I needed people to train with. And that was ironic. So BJ became my student right away. And it wasn't much longer after that, 5-6 months, sometime in the first year of him rolling with me and me just showing what I knew, and then we drilling it. One day I'm really tired and I say, Beach, let's just slap box. I want to see how you move. We square off. He hits me, I'm going to guess about 7 or 8 times in the face before I can even flinch. And now I'm pissed. So now I'm chasing him around the YKO Rec Center in Hilo, trying to get revenge. And he's kicking my ass. And I've got 25 years under my belt at that time and was a good fighter. So that day I'd run to the gym. And so I walked home, head down, I'm thinking, this is it. I just got my butt handed to me by a 17-year-old, and it's over. I mean, I've aged out. And fortunately, he became a world champion. So it took some of the sting off, but very talented kid. Very analytical, knew things without being told about movement and angles, and just like my son Keenan, same thing, an engineer's mind. And he was tough as nails and willing to scrap. Joe Lewis, a famous full contact fighter, friend of mine since passed, told me one time, it's not the guy with technique that's dangerous, it's the man or woman with willingness to engage. And BJ had the willingness to engage. I remember being at my dojo there in Hilo one time, and he came in with some of his buddies who were all taking classes with me and said, we tapped out the judo teacher down at his dojo. No, we don't do those things, no etiquette. I tried to teach them the manners and the etiquette that I'd been taught, but, they were wild street kids. And fortunately, BJ's family had money. So at one point I said to BJ, his dad, who was a good friend of mine, and his parents, both Lorraine and Mr. Penn Sr., were just gracious, beautiful people. I said, I'm going to San Jose. It's Mr. Reyes's 50th birthday party. Half and Caesar's Gym are right down the street. Send BJ with me and I'll introduce him to the guys. And so that was his first exposure outside of me, and he did really well. Camarillo was there, some other athletes, and he was formidable with a year of training under a white belt who knew how to train but didn't know a lot of jiu-jitsu. I knew what I knew, and so we kept practicing. The fact that he has experienced some mental challenges now, I have to attribute it to impact injuries. There's no other really explanation, because he really didn't have these behaviors before. But I am hopeful, because I recently met a fellow who had some brain injury from combat in Afghanistan and other combat zones. And he went through an experimental process where they put in stem cells from his spine into his brain. And he seemed to have had a full recovery and is a best-selling author, etc. And so I've introduced the Penn family to that clinic, and BJ expressed, in dialogue with him recently, expressed an interest. And so he unfortunately, he's struggling in front of his 250 million fans versus the private struggles that most of us have had, and I believe he's going to come through it, and, hopefully he'll come through it and have some lessons and look at it in a way that maybe helps the next generation too.
Yeah. I think the community is quite willing to forgive people who have their dark night of the soul, or dark week of the soul, or dark year of the soul, and then make an effort to come out the other side. I mean, Andrew Wiltsey's struggles with mental illness, which he's gone through a couple of times now, incredibly publicly. 50 years ago, it would have been some crazy guy, getting progressively banned from every gas station in the town that he lives in. Now he's beaming it out. He's live streaming himself getting locked up in the hospital, and running away from the cops who have just tried to arrest him. And it's unfortunate that you're your fall is so public. I suppose it's always been like that for top level celebrities with the paparazzi following them around. But if you got a cell phone, man, you can create a spectacle all on your own.
Life is hard when you have all your resources. It's hard, and it's got to be harder when you struggle. And any one of us could take some experience in our life, and it wouldn't paint us in good light. And so we just have to endure. And I'm, I myself and a million other people are praying that BJ gets through this and comes out on the other side sane and centered and educated on the journey through the journey that he's on. And it's hard to watch. It's hard to watch people struggle. My wife just this last year battled cancer, RCHOP leukemia, and I mean RCHOP treatment. I'll remember the name here in a minute. And radiation, chemotherapy. And it's hard to watch. It's hard to watch the struggle. But I don't believe that empathy is a sin. I think empathy, unlike Elon Musk's suggestion, is not a weakness. It's a superpower. It's a freaking superpower to get out of your own head and have compassion for others. So I have great compassion for BJ and his family, and I'm hoping for the best.
Well, you're in Yellowstone. You've got friends who are fishing that you're not fishing with. I know your wife is long suffering and has allowed you this time to talk to me and the watchers and the listeners, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. Please thank her for me. We didn't get to your art at all. Hopefully there'll be a part 2 when you're not in Yellowstone, and we can go into the art aspect of martial arts, because that would really be interesting to me as well.
Well, I first I want to apologize to anybody who had the time and tenacity to watch this entire interview. I get tired of hearing myself talk, but thank you for the opportunity. And what you're doing today, Stephan, it's important because we don't have any recorded dialogue with the founders, the ones we know of that we respect, the old masters that their names still resonate with us, and we're still doing things that they did, but we didn't really get to hear their motivations. And I had a friend, Bernie Lau. It's his birthday today. Bernie, he's 84. He was probably the first Aikido practitioner, Haole guy, white guy in America. He went to meet Ueshiba with his instructor from Hilo when he was a teenager, and a friend of Ueshiba's gave him a bottle of whiskey to give to Ueshiba. So he's got it in his gym bag. They're there. They're meeting Ueshiba. All his students are there. Bernie's instructor is a friend of Ueshiba. So at some point, Bernie pulls out this bottle of whiskey to give it to Ueshiba, and of course, everybody's like, like talking to the master. Ueshiba put his arm around him, took pictures with them, signed stuff. He was so happy. But later, Bernie was practicing with some of O-sensei's students, and they said, well, this is pretty mellow. Don't you guys do this crank anymore or that? And he said, well, O-sensei's on a spiritual quest, and so he's removed a lot of these things from our practice. That's just where Ueshiba's head was at, and that's what he was doing. And that small insight into what Ueshiba was going through as an aging practitioner and a former soldier was interesting. The next generation and the generation after that will be hearing first hand from the work people like you are doing in this work, the opinions and ideas of the martial artists who came before them, and it should add tools to their toolbox that we didn't have when we were coming up. We were watching karate, illustrated. This from here to here, the next shot here. We didn't know what was really going on in their minds. It was really not transparent. So this kind of work you're doing and recording these ideas, there'll be tools in an archive in the future that allow people, like if we could listen to our great grandfather go on about what he did on a daily basis and what his life was like, it'd be gold. So while I don't think what I'm saying has been very important, maybe 50 years from now, if we survive, this will serve somebody and at least give them some verbiage that they weren't using that describes things that are important to them that we're using, that vocabulary that we have come through repetitive practice that develops over time, maybe it'll serve them. And so thank you for the work you're doing. I always volunteer for podcasts and interviews, not because I'm an egomaniac, of which of course I am, but because I understand the importance of the documenting of ideas and the times and places. Some of the things that we're talking about will be so strange to future generations, but insightful. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Talk to you soon.